So today we're digging deeper into the ideas of deed and creed, action and belief. In the 19th century, what I'd call proto-humanism had the idea that groups should unite not around a creed, as many religious groups require, but deeds or actions. And this came to be summarized as deed, not creed. The idea of deed, not creed has been extended by some to apply to individual beliefs and actions, to say that what we do matters more than what we believe. The phrase has been sometimes reworded as deed beyond creed or deed over creed to recognize that beliefs may indeed matter, just not as much as action. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Go put your creed into the deed, nor speak with double tongue." And he also said the thing done matters and not what is said about it. In contrast, Sam Harris, one of the four horsemen of the New Atheism, wrote a few years ago that we should indeed judge people by their beliefs, because every belief has predictable outcomes in actions. Well, I'm Jone Johnson Lewis, a third-generation humanist, and for the last 30 plus years, an ethical culture leader and a Unitarian Universalist minister. Today, I'm talking with Arthur Dobrin, leader emeritus at the Long Island Ethical Humanist Society, where he served for 33 years. He's also a professor emeritus at Hofstra University, where he taught for more than 20 years. His courses included business and media ethics, moral psychology, East African studies, comparative religion, and essay writing. Arthur published his 30th book this year. He is currently active in community affairs in Nassau County, New York, where he is a member of the Police Commissioners Community Council and the District Attorney's Faith-Based Council. He is also a board member of the Interfaith Institute and teaches at the Westbury Senior Center. So let's jump in. Arthur, what do you see as the relationship between deed and creed, or beliefs and actions?
Well, thank you, Joan. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Well, I think it's complex. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I would say that they are interactive. I'm not sure they can totally be separated. It's inconceivable to imagine somebody takes any actions whatsoever without having some framework in their head as to why they think this is valuable or why it works or some reason why they do it. On the other hand, I'm certain that there are many people whose actions aren't guided by their creed, by their beliefs. The motivation comes in the other direction. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think that they are inextricably intertwined with one another. And for some people, the emphasis is upon the creed, and other people, the emphasis is upon the deed. That may be a matter of temperament. It may be a matter of how we've been brought up.
Okay. The idea of deed, not creed is, as I said in my introduction, something that is from the beginning of the history of progressive religious history and humanistic groups like ethical culture and Unitarian Universalism. How do you think that idea of deed, not creed shaped that history?
Well, I can only speak about it in terms of the ethical culture movement, which I've been involved with now for, I know, since 1968. So that's a long time. And what I see and I understand from the history and how it got unfolded before my joining the movement and since, is that the emphasis, because the creed before deed is, I'm sorry, the deed before creed, is that it's one of the two slogans or three slogans that we have in the ethical movement. And I know at the Long Island Society, it's up on the stage behind our podium. So that's something that we broadcast and try to live by. The way in which that is frequently understood and enacted is in terms of the public sphere. So the history of the ethical movement, when it gets written, often is in terms of we did this, the movement did that, the movement did this, and what we're pointing to are projects, legislation, programs, associations, alliances, affiliate, all those kinds of things, which are very public. I think that is the impact it's had in the ethical movement. I think that has been unfortunate, and I think is not a complete reading of really what we're talking about in terms of deed. The deeds that I think are really where most people live most of the time is in the private sphere. That is, when we wake up and who we meet during the course of the day. It might be the family, it might be a spouse, it might be children, it might be family, it might be neighbors, co-workers, friends, and it has very little to do with the public life. Not that the public life doesn't shape that, it certainly does, but in terms of our own actions, interactions on a daily basis, it really has to do with things that are much closer to us, much more intimate. And that's where I would put the deed. I would put the emphasis there, with the understanding that the public obviously is important because we live within a context. If you live in an awful, oppressive society, it's much more difficult to be a decent and benevolent person. In a more supportive society, of course, it's easier. So you can't separate the public and the private. My critique of the ethical movement, however, is that our emphasis has been very heavily on the public and very little on the private and in the intimate deeds. So that's I don't know if you were asking for a critique, but that's my understanding of the history. And for many years at the Long Island Society, I've attempted to move the focus. I wouldn't say move the focus, but to develop a dual focus where the private and the intimate is at least as important as the public and the more expansive.
Yeah, but it sounds like when you're talking about that, you're talking about private deeds still rather than beliefs on a private level.
Yes, that's right. I haven't talked about how beliefs shape our private deeds, but they do, I think, in the same way that they shape our public deeds.
Mm-hmm.
That is, we have certain notions about how the world works. That's a belief. Some people think it works one way. Some people think it works in a different way. We have certain values that we hold that we believe are more valuable than other values, which we don't hold. So clearly, again is the interaction between the deed and the creed, which I think we cannot separate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when I hear that, I think about how the Buddhists have as one of their central concepts the idea of right belief. Do you think that there are some beliefs that are more likely to result in what you might call the good life, whether that means a happier, more fulfilled life, or one that is productive and contributes to a livable society?
Well, I guess I would separate that into two things, two distinct realms. One would be in terms of some beliefs lead people to lead better lives, more fulfilled lives, more ethical lives, more flourishing lives. I think that it could be almost anything, almost anything on a private level. So in that way, being very tolerant. When you look at it at a larger scope, I think that there are some beliefs that if lots of people buy into them, are not as productive as other beliefs. So for me, what makes the ethical movement distinctive is that we have dispensed with theology. And what I think we have substituted is an anthropology. And I think an anthropological approach to life leads to more productive values that more people can flourish with than other kinds of beliefs that have to do with things which are beyond reason, which are essentially supernatural. It's not to say, going back to my first part of this answer, that people who hold beliefs in the supernatural or theological beliefs. Holding those beliefs for some people may lead to very good lives. I have no doubt about that. And I'm sure all of us know such people. But if you take a looking at the larger picture, I would think that if you needed to choose between two, I would think that the anthropological view tends to lead to a better life for more people than does a theological view.
Okay. Um, that inspires me to ask how you think that compares or contrasts with other kinds of humanistic groups.
Okay.
Like with Sam Harris saying, some beliefs are so awful that we should outlaw them.
Well, there's often confusion between humanism and atheism.
Mhm.
So if you're talking about the four horsemen of atheism, I wouldn't put them all as humanists. To me, the atheism is to say I don't believe in something. Maybe I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in theology. Whereas humanism is saying that I have a faith in human beings, and that as I look at this world, there are certain values that I want to implement. There are certain values I want to promote. There are certain values that I'd like to structure society in such a way that it promotes those values. So humanism to me is value centered, whereas atheism is simply another belief, which is to say I don't believe in X. All it says is I don't believe in X. It doesn't really tell me what you believe in. I mean, you could have an atheist who's can be sitting in prison for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And many of them, in fact, have been atheists. So I don't think that is really the question for us. For us, the issue is really as humanists, as religious humanists, what is it that we do believe in? What are the values that we hold, and where do they come from? And for me, they come out of human experience. They come out of human nature. They don't come out of supernatural beliefs. They don't come out of things which are beyond rational ways of understanding. So that's to me the connection between the creed and the deed. I don't tend to call it a creed, and whether you have a creed or not is very similar to codes of ethics. That is, a code of ethics they're fund basically two kinds of codes of ethics. One code of ethics is very particular, and it spells out in detail what's acceptable, usually what's not acceptable. For example, the New York Times code of ethics that they have in their newsroom goes to 70 plus pages. I mean, you have to be a lawyer to read through this to find out what they consider to be acceptable for a journalist. That's kind of one extreme of a code of ethics. I don't think it's particularly useful. In fact, I think it's often harmful. It leads people to say, okay, this is so detailed. Now I've come across something that's not covered here, so therefore it must be right. In other words, it undercuts critical thinking. The other approach to codes of ethics is the one that's so general that it doesn't help you in any specific instance. I tend to prefer the one that's more general, because what it does is provides a framework for understanding rather than details of what to do. And once you're given a framework, you need to think about this in a particular way. If you're a journalist, in one way; if you're a publicist, in another; if you're a business person, in yet another way. All within the even larger framework of what it is that we mean by being an ethical person, or what an ethical life entails.
Okay. One of the interesting things you did earlier, and I think you built on that in talking about the codes of ethics implicitly, is you kind of shifted creeds from beliefs, meaning, traditionally a creed in a Christian church is things like Jesus was fully human and fully divine, and to believe in that as a concept.
Right.
Or to believe that God exists, or to believe that God doesn't exist, which is sort of what I call the Tinkerbell idea of belief.
Mm-hmm.
And then you shifted to talking about believe in as in values,
Yep.
which are more about what values you're committed to, which is another meaning of the word belief. And I think So what I'm hearing is that the belief in values and the commitment to follow values is more important than those conceptual or philosophical or theological beliefs.
Well, I think ultimately the test is what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And if looking at that way, then yes, deeds are more important than creed, but it's not or concepts or values. But that's not to say that the values and the ideas in them are worthless, because they help shape what it is that you do.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who have really very fine ideas, wonderful ideas, and yet, if you were to know them personally, that's not somebody that I would put my trust in. So it's possible for people to hold certain beliefs and then, not enact them. As you said in the introduction, I taught business ethics for many years at Hofstra. Now, before my time, Bernie Madoff was a student at Hofstra, and if he had been in my business class, and if I taught it in a traditional way, which is, here are the codes of ethics that you need to follow in order to be successful in business, he would have gotten an A. Obviously, I mean, he would have known all the right answers, but the right
Right.
answers, there was a disconnect between the right answers he could give you and the behavior that he engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but the other side of that is there are people who really don't give any thought to what it is that they do, and their behavior is impulsive. It's driven by emotions, and it's things that are irrational, fear, for example. And there they could use much more of the thinking, much more of the top down.
Mm-hmm.
So some people, they need more of the bottom up, and for some people they need more of the top down. But
Mm-hmm.
you can't. But both of them are essential.
Yeah. So you do a lot of interfaith work, and it has occurred to me as we've talked that some of the forums you do have different people from different belief systems talk about that they would come to different conclusions about what to do with an ethical problem.
Yep.
Um, to what extent, and again, getting back to kind of the Sam Harris idea that there might be some limits of what we would find acceptable anyway. What would you see as some of the limits on religious diversity that might work within an ethical society or a humanist group?
Well, we bracket those kinds of theological questions in the ethical society.
Mhm.
So there's no litmus test for what anybody believes in terms of theology. I think that there may be a litmus test in terms of behavior
Mhm.
on the part of some of our members, but that gets to the values. Um, so why it is that somebody is acting in a pro-social way, I don't inquire about what gets them there necessarily. And if somebody is acting atrociously, I don't ask them to, read the Humanist Code of Ethics because that won't make much of a difference either. So, in terms of the interfaith work with the Interfaith Institute that I'm on the board, which was started, by the way, by the Islamic Center of Long Island, which is
Mhm.
maybe I know it certainly is amongst the most progressive Islamic centers in the entire country, which would probably make it amongst the most progressive in the world. As far as I know, in fact, it was the first Islamic center that had a woman as the president of the center. So I'm on the board there. So they're probably not. I'm sure they're not typical. Um, but the programs that I have devised for them is, as you said, I bring together three, it used to be four religious leaders, but that just became unwieldy. So I do three religious leaders, each representing a different religious tradition. And it's never the same three people that I ask. So I'm not stuck always asking liberals, for example. Sometimes I never know. I mean, I've had evangelicals. I've been trying to get Jehovah Witnesses. I've not been very successful with that. But the way the program works is I don't ask them to talk about their religion.
Mhm.
What I do is I present them with a real life ethical decision that somebody has faced, and I have the transcript from that person, and I give them the transcript. I said, here's what so and so was faced with. Here's what they did. Now I say, given your religious faith and what you're deeply rooted in, that you're a leader in that religious faith, what do you think about what this person has done? And that doesn't, so it does, if they bring in theology, and some do, and actually most don't, but those who actually bring in a theological framework, they'll recite chapter and verse from their sacred texts as to why it is that they've reached the conclusion that they have. Almost always there's either agreement amongst the three about, yes, this person did the right thing, or that person didn't do the right thing. Sometimes there will be disagreement about what the person has done, but then it's very clear what they're talking about is a judgment that they're making. That my text tells me that, somebody shouldn't break the law in helping a friend alleviate pain that they may be suffering from. And they'd say, but in fact, that was the dilemma that the scenario that we had this past week when I did this. And there was one of the three who said, no, the law of the land takes precedence over anything else. That was his religious framework. I mean, really very interesting, which led him to the most conservative of the positions, which is, since it's against the law, you don't do it. The other two said, well, my religion says you ought to follow the law of the land. However, there's also another law. And the other law, they both said, leads them to say that compassion is a very strong value. And if there is no alternative to alleviating the suffering other than breaking the law, then it's okay. So no, none of the three were making theological arguments. What they were doing is that they were choosing from their religious framework what helped them to, in all three cases, to really try to be a compassionate person. That's really what it was about. So I have been doing these programs, I don't know, for I think 6 years now, and they are very popular, very insightful. People leave very stimulating and wanting to do more of them. There's never been an argument about these kinds of things. Once an argument flared, and it had to do with a political issue that wasn't what we were talking about. And it was like, okay, so we'll leave that one aside. The two of you would like to talk about that later. You can do that, but let's get back to the one the issue that we're looking at in front of us. So I'm not. I think I've wandered far from your question, but the question was: are there theological beliefs that would be so out there that we would find them unacceptable? Yes, I suppose a religious belief that said that human sacrifice is necessary in order to bring about a better world. That would be a belief that I would say, no, that's one that I don't think anybody following would lead to a better world. Would I outlaw it? No, any more than I would not really. I really disagree with hate speech laws, for example. I don't think we should outlaw speech. I think we should outlaw political speech or speech of ideas. I think we ought to outlaw speech which promotes people to do harm, or promotes people to do certain things that we've said, that's not acceptable. But an idea in and of itself, I don't think that we should outlaw that. Somebody could say whatever they say, that we might consider to be hateful, but they cross the line when they say, well, that what I mean by that is that you ought to go out and kill people because of their skin color or their religious. That's the speech that crosses the line. Not so. People can believe all kinds of hateful things in their religion. I don't. That it bothers me that you think that, because I think that maybe your behavior is going to lead you down a path that's not a good one. But until the behavior gets manifest, I would not outlaw the idea, the religion. I mean, who's to say? I mean, what arrogance to think that my ideas, really trump, 2,000 or 4,000 or 6,000 years of, religious history and beliefs and behavior, where much of it is good, much of it is terrible. But it's not the idea. It's it's how it gets implemented that's the problem.
I think you're, when you go off and talk about interfaith work, I think that's one of the areas where the deed and creed interface or interconnection comes to me as well. I had an experience just the year before the pandemic hit and we stopped doing things in public so much. In up here in the Bronx, we had one of unfortunately too often vigils for a hate crime, and somebody was videotaping the whole thing, and somebody put mics in front of all the different clergy and the imam, asking, how do your beliefs inform your attitude toward these crimes? And they all talked about Allah and God and, Jesus and all those things. And then they stuck the microphone in front of me, not having warned me, and I talked about human worth. And what was very interesting was that after that event, so that really was focusing on beliefs and what beliefs might bring you to a better action. What was really interesting afterwards was it was the local mosque that asked if they could put the clip from my piece on their website, because the piece about human worth resonated with them more than most of what other people had said. So that was, I guess that's sort of a belief that we usually think of as unique to humanism, but that clearly speaks to people who have other theological beliefs.
Oh, I think it does. And I've stayed away from promoting theological discussions, in the Faith Institute. I think often they lead to clarifying the divisions rather than clarifying where the common ground is.
Right.
Whereas if you present something that's a real life ethical problem that's not theological in nature, I think you're much more likely to find where the common ground is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to return to the idea of deed over creed or deed not creed as a community agreement, because that's where it got, that phrase got to be very prominent in the 19th century. The idea that we, instead of having a creed that was the condition for joining, it was an agreement that the unity would be on deed, in other words, on behavior. Do you think that a group that has religious let me ask that a different way. Do you think religious diversity within a group like an ethical society can work?
I haven't seen it work in practice, not with any ethical movement. I am not all that familiar with Unitarians, but it seems to work within a Unitarian framework. I think the difference is that for us in ethical culture, ethical humanism, we clearly state that we're here to cultivate ethics. If it's ethical culture, we're here to cultivate humanism. If it's ethical humanism, if that's the rubric we're using. So our purpose is to bring people together around those common values. Our purpose is not to bring people together around their religious diversity. So we don't have religious symbols from all religions around the room. What we have is the humanist symbol. So in practice, I just haven't seen that, at least at the Long Island Society, we attract people with lots of different committed religious beliefs. I mean, vaguely, yes. When it comes to some high holidays, in Judaism, people will attend those, or not come on the Sunday if it happens to coincide with a high holy day or something like that, or around Easter, or I think people have these ties to traditions, and maybe even have some vague ties to the religion, but that really plays no role in the ethical society. We haven't said, let's celebrate Christmas, let's celebrate Passover together. What we've said is let's celebrate what it means to be human together. So that's been our common ground. Is it possible to put together something that's built around religious diversity, I think it's more difficult, although you could say the Unitarians have been more successful than the ethical cultures movement has been. So maybe I'm wrong about that, but I really would like to build and want to build, and I think it's important to build a movement that is centered on human values rather than on theological beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Felix Adler in that founding address talked about that everyone is welcome from the believer to the infidel. And
Mm-hmm.
I have found that different ethical societies have different cultures around that, that there are some where some of the longtime committed members are definitely theistic, um, and still call themselves humanists, and
Mm-hmm.
others where people don't want to call themselves humanists because they don't like um, some aspect of that, either because they are theist or because they believe it's too narrow. Um, so I've been in societies which have quite a bit of diversity in the creed, in terms of what they individually believe, but they don't tend to bring that to the ethical society, other than,
Yeah.
that, and just like we don't bring our special holidays to the ethical society generally.
Yeah. So I do know some members well enough over the years that we've talked about these kinds of religious or theological or spiritual terms. And there are some people who are very committed who do believe in God. And there are
Mhm,
some who believe in some kind of spiritual power or force in the universe or a higher power.
mhm,
Um, but they don't talk about that. The society, because the society never really talks about it collectively, it tends to attract people who are not interested
mhm,
in those kinds of questions. So
mhm,
again, I said for all practical purposes, it seems to me that the theological questions are beside the point for us.
mhm.
They don't arise in any serious, sustained way.
Yeah, I think another area where this comes up with ethical societies, and it also comes up with Unitarian Universalist congregations, is couples with dual affiliations. They each have their own religious affiliation, and they're looking for some place that is not going to condemn one or the other, um, but where the kids can be raised with something that is unique, and necessarily where not necessarily require the kids to make a choice.
Yeah.
I think in contrast of somebody I knew who was raised, she had to go to the Baptist church on odd number Sundays and the Catholic church on even number Sundays, um, because of her
Okay.
parents' diversity, and that's how they took care of that.
Yeah. Well, I know couples that have come to the society that are interfaith, and what they want from the society in regards to their children. Well, teach them about Judaism, teach them about Christianity, teach them about different religions, so that we become sort of this umbrella where the kids can learn and then ultimately choose for themselves. That's not the approach that I support for the Sunday school. I think we ought to be promoting humanist values. And whatever the parents want out of religion, you let them do it. But we're not the umbrella that says if you're Jewish, come here, and if you're Protestant, come here, because you're not going to kill each other. I mean, I
Mhm,
think it's what we're saying is that, as you talked about it earlier, Joan, human worth. What we're talking about is human worth. We're promoting human worth. What does that mean? How do we teach our children to respect all people?
mhm.
And if that means learning a little bit about what people believe, religions and other things, that's certainly appropriate. But that is not the purpose of the programs that we have for children.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Um, so for you, it sounds like the idea of diversity of belief in an ethical society is more that we don't focus on that, that it is there or it isn't there, but it's not the focus. Even the diversity isn't the focus.
Right.
What's the focus is on the values and how do we live that good life.
Yes. And what does that mean both personally and publicly? So
Mhm.
what does it mean in terms of legislation? What does it term? What is, this is all the social action
Mhm.
aspect of the society, but also the other part of it, which is the more personal part. Um, I have three values that I would not ever want to dispense with. I'm sure we could add others because this doesn't fill it all out, but I do think that they're fundamental, and I do think that it applies to both the personal and the public lives. And those three values are generosity, humility, and kindness.
Mhm.
I think out of those three, you could work out a very good life, a life that is really worthwhile for everyone. I think it takes us. It certainly addresses the intimate, but it does get us to the larger questions of social justice as well. I think with those three, and maybe having three is a wobbly stool to create, and maybe that's why it's difficult for us. But I do think that out of those, we could really work out a very good program of what it means to have created a life of human flourishing, which I think is the life of human happiness.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting that again you get back to values instead of principles. Um,
Hmm.
and we have tended, even in ethical culture, to talk in terms of principles like act so as to bring out the best in others and thereby in yourself. Um, and what's especially interesting right now at this moment in history with that is that the Unitarian Universalists are debating over a process of a few years replacing their seven principles of what commonly is believed with a set of values instead of the principles. So generosity is one of the values in that circle of values. Um,
Yeah.
and and that is somewhere between belief and action, it seems to me.
Hmm.
Values lie somewhere between there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. No, I think that is correct. And I had another thought that just went out of my head, but
Okay.
it'll come to me some other time. Oh, I know what it was. There is a problem with values, however, and that is that values differ from culture to culture. You
Mhm.
could say that the principles are derived from human reason, and therefore
Mhm.
they really transcend cultures, the cultural differences. Values have a hard time doing that. But I think that it's possible to do it if you look at human nature, and you can then separate ethics from social conventions. And I think that often social conventions are what's promoted as values, whereas I think social conventions can be useful, but some social conventions are really unethical.
Mhm.
Um, but I would make the distinction between uh, ethical values and social conventions.
Mhm. Okay, that's helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to add that I haven't
Well,
asked
probably I've been talking about these things for 50 plus years. So
about?
yeah, as soon as we're finished, I'll say, oh, I didn't say that.
Uh-huh.
Okay. But no,
Well,
nothing that comes to mind right now.
yeah, I mean, as you said at the very beginning, this is a complex subject and there is just a whole lot of depth to it. So thank you so much, Arthur, for being here today and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Joan.
And I want to invite our listeners to check out the eManifold YouTube channel for more digging deeper into the ideas of humanist and progressive religious community.